Well, it's 12:15, so we're going to start right on time. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this surreal RSNA. So I know some of you are probably really disappointed because somebody thought this was ale on tap, which is not the case. So we're going to be talking about AI, of course. I mean, it's kind of the subject that has been on everybody's mind. There are some very important considerations that few vendors are thinking about, and we brought together this group of panelists to have some really broad perspective on the various elements that govern AI, and also what it should be thinking about to actually help not just medical workflows, but also the patients, right? Most importantly, the patients. So I'm going to introduce our panelists real quick. We have right here Laura, who is a professor of neuroradiology at University of Wisconsin. Skip Kennedy joins us from Kaiser Permanente. He runs infrastructure and clinical solutions for Kaiser. We have Alan Pitt, who is also a professor of neuroradiology at the Barrow Institute in Phoenix. We have Dr. Siddiqui as well here, who is our CMO from Hyperfine. And Jonathan Shoemaker, who runs clinical applications and systems and services for Stanford Healthcare. So you can see in the various backgrounds of our panelists, well, myself, less important, I run the business side of Dicom Systems, so I'm on the vendor side. But the various perspectives of our panelists are going to bring in all the key pieces of how AI should be viewed in the healthcare enterprise. So we have physicians, we have professors, we have infrastructure people, and workflow people. Right? All of these things come together if you're going to have a successful look at AI. So, hello. The first topic we're going to talk about is the concept of AI on tap, and what I mean by that is how do we get AI to become more like a utility, right? Like the utility company, literally the electric services that serve your house, the gas services. AI, there are so many entrants in the space that it's virtually impossible to curate and review everybody that's got some kind of new solution for a part of the workflow, right? There are thousands of entrants in this space. There are a few companies that are curating AI on behalf of hospitals. There are some grumblings about that too, right? There are physicians that say, well, who are you to choose for me what AI you're going to make available through your platform for me, right? So it should be more physician-centric. So let's talk about that first. How do we get AI to become a utility from that perspective? Who would like to address that first?
Sure, I can do that. So nice to meet you all. Welcome to getting to the tail end of RSNA.
Is your mic on?
I thought so.
Yeah, you just need to speak into it.
Okay. So I'm just going to give you a perspective that maybe is a little dated, but hopefully moving forward can kind of help you think about it. I don't know why folks are here, but I'm presuming that you either want to figure out how to get into the AI market or you want to bring AI to your practice. Unfortunately, I guess, I should say I'm old enough that I've lived through the PACS transition from film to filmless. And when PACS came up, it was really an issue of change management, right? There were early adopters, there was mid-levels and low-level people trying to adopt it. I think as you look at AI, I see it as a similar opportunity to PACS, where change management is going to be absolutely key to making it something for widespread adoption, probably more than the technology. The technology is going to continue to improve over the next 5 years, but I think if you're looking at it from a practice perspective, first you have physicians who are anxious that somehow or another AI is going to replace them. I actually think the converse is true. I think we have a very limited number of physicians right now, and we're seeing that across the nation, that radiologists are gaining more leverage because there's so few of us. But it's going to be talking to the people in that practice about what this means, how we use it, what it means as a business tool. And there's probably a lot of lessons that can be learned from the transition from film to filmless, the PACS world, 20 years ago, that are equally applicable to the transition from the pre-AI to the post-AI world. And I think thinking through some of the challenges that we saw, both from the radiologists themselves and referents, are equally applicable to this transition as well. But I think keeping that in mind is a very big deal. Probably the biggest advice I can give to any group of radiologists that is thinking about AI is hire for expertise. You know, we all hire for something. I hire for biopsy, I hire for neuro, I hire for mammo. You might want to think about hiring for a radiologist who has a skill, but also takes ownership of this new technology and onboarding of that process.
To kind of build on Dr. Pitt's perspective, too, one of the main things that is typically left behind is governance. So before you even go down this path, you have to have a solid governance model, because AI for imaging is going to span beyond radiology. And on top of that, you know, from algorithm selection, you may want to do A/B testing between two different algorithms. But then also, what is your QA process to ensure that you don't have drift, that your data is giving you the results that you're looking for? And typically, those departments don't exist. You know, if you have your clinical physicians and you have your PACS administrators, or IT, data science is not part of that. How do you evaluate which algorithm works best for your data, or when does it stop working for your data? So when are you going through and continuously testing and evaluating these algorithms as new ones come out? When do you move it from a pre-prod state into prod and then eventually sunset? And that's just the non-graph, the non-GUI, AI algorithms that go into it. But your governance model is going to be very important as to how those decisions get made versus anyone and everyone is going to have, their own favorite, or they built their own and they want to bring it in. And just for sanity and to keep everyone's hair on their head, you have to have a stage gate that you kind of walk through before you bring that algorithm into clinical, so that the exams that was applied to are documented, you understand it, from a medical legal perspective as well. And for the radiologist too. I mean, if you're throwing continual different algorithms in front of them, the frustration level is going to get very high.
I'm going to add to that. One of the downsides of being sort of an infrastructure guy is, by definition, you're a pessimist. It's inevitable. It goes with the job description. So I gave a talk recently, a presentation to our executive team, in which I said we were profoundly unready to and unprepared for AI. And they immediately started asking questions about the AI itself. And I said, that's absolutely not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is the infrastructure necessary to support AI in a scalable manner. And they said, but you've had some early successes. And we're going, doing something once or twice is fundamentally different than doing it in an enterprise scale with a multiplicity of different solutions. And we're going to have a completely different infrastructure in order to do that. At which point they, of course, looked at me and said, how many millions do you need? Which is the other downside of being an infrastructure guy. So.
Yeah, I can add to that as well. And so, like, from the academic perspective, we have a little bit of a different structure. And so we have actually been testing some different AI algorithms at University of Wisconsin, including things for like PE, cervical spine fractures, and like bleeding. But essentially, we have about, and this is not something that can be done necessarily in private practice setting, but like for us, because we like doing a lot of research, there's a lot of AI people in a big med physics department, we have about 4 radiologists that are very IT heavy and invest a lot in looking at what products we want to test at UW. The other thing that we have the advantage of that is, part of the discussion that should be had for people that don't have this advantage is we have a close relationships with the company that provides our PACS, and so we're actually able to integrate it with our PACS how we want to. But that's going to be one of the important things, is like how this is presented to the radiologist to make it seamless workflow. And so for us, we can kind of adjust that ourselves. And then we actually do have about another like 3 or 4 scientists that are looking at like the actual outcome. So actually checking like our accuracy, checking all of that stuff and giving it back to us and telling us how we're doing. That's obviously not possible everywhere, but I do really think that even if you are in a private practice setting, having at least one person that's going to kind of champion this and actually help pick out what products and how to do that is essential. But yeah, there's probably going to be a whole range of how each institution decides to do this. We just have kind of a bigger approach to it because we're doing our own algorithms in addition to testing more company-based things. So.
Anything to
I
add?
think everybody said enough.
We're done now, ready for lunch, right?
No. I mean, like, when you talk about AI on tap, how does it become utility? To me, translation is as if window level, right? When is window level become utility? When was the last time we asked that question? Or when did you start using mouse compared to film? So to me, it's the same question. That becomes, and typically any technology adoption curve, think about that stuff like utilization. There's a tipping point that comes in where before that is a nuisance to use it, and after that you got to use it every single time, otherwise pain in the butt not to use it, right? So in your clinical workflow, if 15% or more of your cases require use of some kind of automated tool that is detecting, classifying, helping characterize what you're doing, automatically it'll become utility. Before that, it'll be just a niche solution requiring experts, some infrastructure optimization, something special to make it work. For it to become that utility, it needs to cross that tipping point in your clinical workflow, and then it becomes utility, then it becomes routine, then you want. And that's how 3D imaging was. You know, nobody wanted to use it was niche, it was workstation, till it got to stage that you was doing it everybody. Now you have to do it everybody, otherwise, if you don't have it, it's a pain in the butt. So I see any kind of technology utilization in the same manner, that for it to become routine, it needs to cross that tipping point of how many clinical scenarios and how many of your workflow you're using it in. Then it's routine use, otherwise it's a niche and requires special people, special technology, special things to do it.
I think in 10 years, there's going to be operationally a new department that will manage a lot of this, you know, where you have, you know, the physician scientists, you know, the infrastructure, you know, specialists, the analysts, and, you know, the data scientists.
John, do you
will
see that
manage it
specific
across.
to imaging, or do you see that as an enterprise? Because there's a lot more to AI than just imaging AI, obviously.
Yeah.
Do you see an AI department itself?
I see, like, yeah, almost an AI department, because it, yeah, it's going to bleed into everything.
Right.
Yeah.
All the NLP stuff that happens with the EMR, et cetera. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, the
Support.
interesting comment about that, though, is that there definitely has to be a strong vendor involvement in this, whether it's the infrastructure or the algorithms themselves. And so are the vendors building for the academics, who are often one-offs in a small market? Are the vendors building for private practice, which is where scale and their markets are, and what that looks like? I think they're very different applications of the same technology in terms of what they want.
All of the above.
Yeah, but
This is a perfect segue to the next question, by the way.
Absolutely.
Who's it
I
getting
think
built for?
To close out that first topic, I think the important part, that the takeaway I would love for us to have as a group is, it's not about the brand of the AI company building this. Because right now, it's all about that brand, right? They're trying to get in everybody's face about, I'm the best algorithm for XYZ, when we really need them to become microservices that are helping along the way in the workflow, adding value, not adding penalty to the process, right? And then with Dr. Siddiqui's input, we actually recently added a topic that I think is superbly important to all of us, and that is the importance of the patient-centric thinking, right? All of these vendors are helping along a portion of the workflow, but what about the patient in all this? Right, so would you like to take this?
I mean, the way I think about it is things that have been successfully implemented and used and takes traction is all, at the end of the day, focused on the patient. The way I see it, everybody's serving the patient on top. Patient is first. You know, physicians serve the patient. Staff in the hospital serving the patient and the physician to get their job done. And us, technology vendors, are serving all of those folks to deliver that value to the patient. Whatever you're building, at the end of the day, if you're not designing it to create value for the patient, you'll have a hard time getting it through, right? And how do you provide that value to the patient? It could be indirectly, you're optimizing something for the workflow for Dr. Pitt so that he can get things done faster, more accurate, more things. Yeah, it's value at the end to the patient. But if you have to think about whatever you're implementing right now in your practice, how is it actually going to serve the patient, going to make a difference in patient's care or not? And then a lot of times, solutions talk about like, let's do detection, and I kind of think about solutions that I'm seeing take off that think about the entire care continuum of the patient, right? It's not a department-centric solution, it's not a physician-centric solution, it is a patient care-centric solution. One example, I would pick one of the stroke-based AI applications. Yeah, they have an AI algorithm that detects large vessel occlusive stroke, that's great, but it's the communication framework, the entire application end-to-end that connects the entire stroke team together to deliver that service immediately to the patient. I'm sure the neurological team know what I'm talking about. That's what brings the value. Is 90% of the value really is nothing to do with AI. AI is the trigger point that starts that entire workflow and deliver and change the patient's management. That's how I think about, as you think about your AI solutions, implementing it, are they really solving a patient problem? Are they really solving your end-to-end clinical workflow problem, or it's really a departmental one-person solution?
I'd like to take a slightly different position on that.
Do it.
So I actually am beginning to ponder things where AI gets to the edge, to the patient themselves. So at the Barrow, we're looking at developing a solution. So we have an algorithm that can identify the 10% of patients who likely might benefit from a shunt if they have NPH. And so we can give that to clinicians when they're looking at a CT scan, but we're not getting access to hundreds, thousands of CTs that are read in the community by physicians who might not be thinking about that. An alternative approach would be to say, look, most patients, and I fundamentally believe this, most patients are alone on their journey towards wellness. If you get a diagnosis, your specialist tells you something, the next thing you do is you go to Google, you try to find this, you try to find that, you try to understand what this report means, what they just said, which when you weren't listening, and you have a lot of trouble finding resources to help you understand, what do I do now? They're asking me to get a surgery, is that really the right thing for me? And I think AI in the hands of the individual has an enormous upside. So in this simple use case, we're looking to build out an easy way to take your images, put them in the cloud, have AI look at it as something of a second opinion, basically say, yes, you look like you may have NPH, or no, you have kind of routine atrophy. And oh, by the way, here's a connect to 5 centers of excellence, including Stanford, by the way. I would like to have you on board.
Perfect, thank you.
But centers of excellence who would take you to the next step to see if this is actually the right thing to do. I think trying to put the AI all the way into the hands of that patient, whether it's for second opinion for image interpretation or reinterpretation of the gobbledygook that the radiologist dictated, is a real opportunity to push AI out to the edge to make it truly patient-centric.
Remind me to get a translator for a report from you.
Yeah, I try to dumb it down, but Florent, I just don't speak with an accent. It's really high.
So what strikes me as an important point to make for this is that AI is typically involved in those information systems that are used by the clinicians. But the moment that the results of those algorithms are delivered, everything else is up to a human to take forward, right? So AI, I mean, where do you see AI stopping? I mean, you just mentioned having AI-centric or patient-centric AI for what happens after a patient receives a report. But so once you've received results in your UI, which is already an important question, right? What is the manifestation of that result in the user interface? Many vendors have different answers to that, and we need to unify all of that. But once you've received your results, it's a human looking at images to verify the veracity of that finding, right? So it's still very much a human taking the process forward.
Well, I think a couple things have to happen. First is, the patient has to get the images, right? We're still giving patient images on CDs, right? Who has a CD drive?
Yeah.
I don't. Can't do thumb drives. because, virus loads. But once, they have the report, then you have to translate it into, just typical, easy to understand linguistics, but then also link it to the images. And that, AI would be very good for that. But then you also have patient-acquired information, from wearables that could also feed into that. And much like what the DNA companies have done, where as new algorithms come through, new sequences are run, and they'll give you an alert like, hey, this may have detected this may have detected that. But that's a whole service, that the industry has to get to exposing, providing the patients all their information. Yeah.
Well, I mean, personally, as a patient, I'm not an MD, so whenever I get results, I'm counting on my physician to tell me what those results mean, right?
And Dr.
So
Google's dangerous.
I'm not the ultimate recipient of that report. I have a professional interpreting that for me, so that I don't have to wonder what I'm looking at.
Can we digress and talk about that report?
Please.
So I grew up in Pakistan. My dad was a radiologist. I saw every single time a report would be typed up, given to the patient to take to the physician with the films, right? So I grew up seeing every patient getting the report first, written by a radiologist for the clinician, given to the patient. That's how I grew up. Here I show up and now suddenly that report is dumb, too complicated for people in the US, just boggles my mind. That, the whole world, India, China, everybody go, patient is the one that takes the report to the clinician. What's unique about the US where we have to dumb the report down? There's 4 billion people taking reports to clinicians themselves, there's no problem. They're all Googling, they're all doing the same thing, but there's no hoo-ha happening, people are getting scared, physicians are getting hammered by it, but that's somehow a problem in the US. So anyway, I get really, we've done this at University of Maryland when I was there, we give extra, mammography, right? Every patient gets mammography report themselves. Nothing happens. We've been doing it for decades now. Yeah. So I think this...
But I mean, I think that result is just the business of medicine and how it varies by country. I think we as radiologists don't give reports to patients because our referents get ticked off that we're somehow getting involved in their care before the referent is able to engage.
What I'm saying is, I'm sorry to digress from AI topic here, but I'm saying there's an artificial thing. If you actually start doing it, you don't see anything happening.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what the stance has been of radiologists. I'm not agreeing with that.
Enough talk about that topic. Let's get back.
All right. Let's get back to it. So our next topic is, it actually brings me back about 25 years when OpenMRI started coming out, right? OpenMRI was a way for the industry to address the claustrophobia that patients experienced in a tunnel for an hour or more getting imaged. The issue with OpenMRI became really quickly that nobody wanted to read those images because they were too noisy. And so there's a cottage industry that appeared along the way that applied some algorithms already. 20, 25 years ago, the technology was there to smooth out, sharpen images to the point where a radiologist would want to read it or could read it, right?
The word was smooth.
Smooth.
Yeah.
So I think now I'm hearing all about this new image enhancement era that's related to modalities. When I thought that this problem had been solved a long time ago. But now it's not about just the sharpness or smoothing of the image, it's about how long is the patient getting imaged, right? So it's reducing the amount of time that, and this is just an example, right? It's just for MRI, for open MRI, or for Hyperfine, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So if you have a low signal to noise ratio, sure, you're going to need some enhancement.
It's more than that, though. I mean, you're starting to see, and you're seeing on the floor at this meeting, embedded AI on the modality that replicates functionality in downstream. So upstream AI, I predict, and I'll see if I'm right, is going to be huge because it's a platform, that's has a built-in revenue source. I mean, you're selling the scanner.
Yeah.
You don't have to come up with another $1.50. Somewhere along the line to pay for an algorithm. So for the big modality vendors, they're not leaving that on the table. They're going to do it there.
And that's what I was going to point out, is that 20, 25 years ago, the modality vendors caught on to the fact that they needed to integrate image enhancement when they sold a new scanner.
Yeah.
So now, you've got Hyperfine that is a prime example of that. AI drives much of what you do.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So, 64 millitesla scanners are not new. Toshiba built first one, in the 80s, the 0.064 Tesla scanner. Obviously, images weren't that great to do anything like that. So, and again, when Picker started with their first superconducting 1.5 magnet, before that was all low field that was coming out, but the image quality just wasn't there to get to it. So when we started this idea of portable MRI that can drive to the patient's bedside, we had to figure out how do you do that in a safe environment, and had to come down to the 64 millitesla field strength on a permanent magnet that you can bring to the patient's bedside. And issue became like, how do you improve image quality? I mean, there's been 30 years now, improvement in electronics, improvement in a lot of different things, just sensors, just the whole GPUs, all that stuff. So take advantage of all those things to bring it here. And then on top of it, using machine learning, deep learning to think about next generation of reconstruction technology, right? So what we do is we do multiple things in how we do our imaging, but one of the things we are doing is reconstruction. So we replace the fast Fourier transform to a neural CNN-based image reconstruction that takes the raw signal from each channel of the coil, creates K-space. From K-space to image creation is a multi-deep layered CNN, convolutional neural network, that actually generates the image. And by doing it that way, you are taking advantage of a lot more data, because if you remember MR, we undersample to create images. So once the image is created in the image domain, a lot of data is lost from the channels that you're bringing in. But if you're taking advantage of all the channel data, you have a lot more data to play with, and you can create a lot more images, high quality images from that. So that image quality is now approaching 1.5T level image quality for T1, T2, and FLAIR on a 64 millitesla scanner. And then multiple things are there, right? We've done training models to train if the patient's head is positioned properly, what the orientation is, so we don't need MR tech to do slice selection. All that stuff happens automatically. If the head is tilted, to recognize that and do auto alignment on those things. And then we apply, patch-based denoising, also another deep learning-based reconstruction that maps out what is the noise in the environment, and then removes that noise using a multi-layer neural network to create the sharper, crisper images coming out of it. So it's not actually applying processing on the image domain. It is actually applying all these techniques at the frequency domain before the image is actually created.
I got a question for the audience. How many of you have access to a Hyperfine? Anyone? No one? You will within the next 2 years. So we have access. We just installed a Hyperfine at the Barrow for one of our adjacent hospitals. And I'm a big, I don't have any financial interest in Hyperfine. I wish I did. Hyperfine is a super interesting use case in many ways, for kind of the future of imaging. So we installed a Hyperfine. One of my partners basically threw up all over the images. They're like, this thing stinks. I don't know why we're using it. It makes no sense. And the problem is that Hyperfine, for all intents and purposes, today, does not look anything like a 1.5 or what an expectation is of a 1.5. However, Hyperfine offers an essential feature, which is access to care for patients who are at a distance with a low-cost modality. My question is, I have a whole bunch of hospitals, and I have a patient who had a stroke, and I got to figure out, do I move them tonight, or can they go to the clinic tomorrow? And I got to know that answer, and if I don't know that answer, I got to stick them in an ambulance or stick them in a helivac and ship them. So Hyperfine answers that question for me, which is hugely valuable. Hugely valuable. You have to define, are you getting images for the radiologist to make them happy, or are you getting images for the patient to add value in their life cycle? In my opinion, Hyperfine adds value for the patient's care. It's a really big deal. It's not about the radiologist as much as it is about, can I move this patient to the next step in their care in a way that I have confidence? For any of you who are having a practice and you've got remote sites and you're looking for a way to, triage patients, you should definitely, take a look at Hyperfine. It's very unique. You will, however, have a problem, just like AI algorithms, where if you introduce some new technology, the biggest issue you're going to have is change management. There's going to be a percentage of your practice that's going to be like, I'm not doing this AI algorithm. I'm not looking at these images. So they're not good enough.
So Alan, it occurs to me that if nobody in this room has a Hyperfine, you may not know what a Hyperfine is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Hyperfine is the first portable MRI on the market. It's a revolutionary technology because it brings the imaging to the patient versus the patient having to be moved to the imaging.
So it's basically the size of this projector table, just about, and it costs $150K, $100K, you know, something that's very cheap. You can literally plug it in the wall. You don't need any shielding. It can go in all sorts of wacky spaces that you couldn't normally put a standard MR, which might cost you, $1.5 million for that magnet and another $1 million plus for the install, and it's got all sorts of things. All of a sudden, you have the ability to have MR images, which are getting better and better every month, in strange new places.
So AI.
I don't need to be here. Can I go now? You guys can take care of talking about Hyperfine.
He's a new VP of sales, I think.
Like what Dr.
So, no, but the point is AI is to a great extent what allowed Hyperfine to develop
Absolutely.
a super portable device,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Without it, you just couldn't. So let's move on to the next topic, which is
I think
very
we
much
have-
related, though. Oh, sorry, please go ahead.
I mean, to further build on what Dr. Pittman was saying, though, too, is you have to classify the algorithms in, if you're a transfer center for stroke and it's going to take you 20 minutes to transfer the image in, before that AI is run, you have to put the AI where it's being acquired. And if it's on the modality, that's one thing. If it's in route, in line, your stat path, that's another thing. If you have to look at the priors, you're going to do a prospective, and then you start to get into a timing issue with the objects. When you're expecting the report, from the algorithm versus when the images are being displayed in the PACS or to the patient or to make the decision on whether or not you transfer the patient, you have to basically reverse what you would expect in a centralized enterprise imaging model. And that may mean, placing some of these algorithms that you license as, say, Stanford at a transfer center, so that you then can see, what's the percentage of stroke that this patient has, so that they can make the decision whether or not, to transfer it. Because if you transfer it and they don't have a stroke, you're on the hook for paying for that, right? So, I mean, you have to go through and almost define, what portions within your platform are you going to place these algorithms? Because then that's going to depend. What do you route? When do you route? When do you expect it back? Do you have to hold it before you get the report, before it's submitted in front of the physician? What status is that in the PACS, depending on the PACS that you have, depending on their work list configurability, whether they're like it's arrived, waiting on AI received, it's been verified by the tech, it's accurate, it's the right patient. And that's if everything works in a utopian world, which thank God it does, and we have no unspecified exams and there's no humans involved. I mean, those are some of the things that you have to kind of think about as you're moving down this path. And then for user acceptance, I mean, that's where governance really needs to come in, because everyone is going to have their opinion. And you can't stop progress because one or two individuals don't agree with X, and that's, where you need to have the governance structure and the decision makers up front before you really begin down this process. Having one or two algorithms running, or maybe 10, in your enterprise is awesome. In about 10 years, we're going to have hundreds. How do you manage that?
That's a scaling problem, and I'm really concerned with is
is it on-prem,
the multiplicity.
off-prem? Yeah.
So
And it's going to be a hybrid.
The problem of workflow design that integrates AI is one that we're going to actually talk about in just a bit. But clearly, the profusion of AI that's hitting the market is going to exacerbate the problem, right? Because if we are impacting the workflow, not just the performance of the radiologist, but the rate at which images can be produced, things like that need to be taken into account whenever new AI needs to be integrated in an existing workflow. So let's talk briefly about, because we've already been talking about this, but because there are so many entrants in the space, we are seeing, at least as a vendor, right? We don't develop AI as a vendor, we integrate AI as a vendor, right? But what we're seeing, especially at this show, is the necessity to consolidate the industry. There's going to be some M&A that's inevitable. There's going to be some large companies like the GEs and Philips of the world, I guarantee are going to start buying up these algorithms to integrate them within their packs or within their modalities. And then then there's a problem of curation, right? That is one of the issues that we're seeing, is that yes, you have companies that are very competent and that are aggregating AI, right, and presenting to you a stable of possible algorithms for you to choose from. But what if the algorithms that my physicians want are not in that marketplace? Now I need to be a member of 2 or 3 or 4 different marketplaces. That is not sustainable either, right? In the short run, that may be okay. How do you see this as a physician? How do you see this as an infrastructure professional?
I would say one thing to avoid, and bad examples are wonderful teaching tools. And what we did with image exchange is what we need to avoid in AI, is the tribalization and the balkanization of the solution, which we still suffer.
Yeah.
Once we started down that road, we were stuck essentially.
Yeah.
Everything works in a walled garden. It works beautifully, right? But then when you have to start combining walled gardens, it just takes time. You have proprietariness. Right now, you potentially could end up with multiple platforms. That's awesome. You add 4 additional routes. You can burst it out. You can integrate the microservices. But what if they don't give you the algorithm in a Docker? What do you do with the Docker? Is it on-prem? Do you have the GPU, CPU infrastructure to support that? Or do you put it in the cloud? Do you have the timing if you have to move the object, from the modality to the router to the cloud, back down for the report? These are all things that you're going to have to look at building out and considering. But further, it gets really, really complex, and you have to look at the underlying, informatics infrastructure, because if you do have 2 or 3 platforms, those are all hitting with FHIR calls, query retrieve calls. Can your underlying imaging infrastructure even support that, right? Because your query retrieves are going to explode.
Right.
Your network utilization is going to explode. Your server utilizations, and that's where if Google Play Store has a phenomenal app, and I'm an Apple guy, I'm out of luck. Unless I go and I buy an Android device, right? And that's kind of where we're going to be. It's great to have all the marketplaces, but the marketplaces have to share. And the reason they're doing that is so that they can control the delivery and the experience and the support of it.
The technology piece is great. Dr. Eisenmenger, Laura, I was wondering, you have a pretty robust AI program there at Wisconsin.
Correct.
What are you doing to kind of educate the future radiologist, the resident of today, in terms of how this is going to be part of their practice? Are you bringing that forward in your program?
Yeah, we definitely do. So like I said, we do implement different algorithms now, and it does help with workflow. It's not ideal, so I'll go into that in a second, but we definitely teach them about future AI algorithms. They learn some about where it's going to help with workflow for us. Right now, it's integrated where if there's an abnormal study, it pops up on everybody's computer so that somebody grabs that first, but it doesn't show up on our actual list of subjects. They do use it overnight as kind of a screening thing, because we went with more higher sensitivity and less specificity. And so again, that's kind of a discussion with each algorithm of what you want to do. But we have ones where, if there's any blood on a head CT, it's going to catch it, but it's going to catch a lot of things that aren't blood. So it's kind of more of a screening tool. But we definitely have the residents use that overnight, and they like it a lot because it helps them prioritize the list whenever they're getting slammed and they're alone. So it helps us during the day for sure, but it's also just a safety gap that we use now. But one of the things that has been brought up multiple times is how is this going to work? And I agree. I think that each program is probably going to like different algorithms, and ideally it would be something sort of like EMR, where Epic, for example, they come to each individual program and they kind of design it based on that infrastructure of that hospital or network, and adjust it to what they need. And so I think in an ideal world, I would love it if it could be a little bit more customizable and kind of put different algorithms together from different companies. But that's why you need to have somebody take ownership of that and have that work on a more nationwide and international level. But
Well, let me ask a question to the audience. How many people are following the IHE work on AI infrastructure in Regenero and company? If you haven't looked at that, I really highly recommend it. It's great work. It may not be the exact way we end up doing it, but the idea of having a standard infrastructure as opposed to a multiplicity of idiosyncratic infrastructures is essential to us. So if you haven't read it, read it.
Very good. This is the last slide, I swear.
It's a lot of words.
So I want to look at challenges and success factors for AI deployment with a little bit more specificity. So we've talked about this a little bit already, right? How do you vet AI for your own practice? Whether you are in a large hospital setting or a private practice makes a big difference, right? Because you're going to have different access to infrastructure than a large hospital does. So what is the vetting process at the Barrow, for example?
I wish I could say that we had a vetting process to speak of. I mean, right now, frankly, we're stumbling because our infrastructure, our onboarding for AI algorithms is primitive. We're on Merge Unity, which is a variant of Merge. It's very difficult to integrate AI into our workflow. We're starting to build out an AI lab to have those as isolated, but that's really for research purposes. For me personally, I think when I look around the showroom floor, my real question for all of these vendors, and it's very difficult for me to tell the difference between Neuro Quant and QSnaps and all these things are all promoting very similar problem solving, all of which is not really relevant to me. And so when I'm looking to vet and add something to my workflow, I'm pretty much looking for a business justification that this is offering me something, whether you call it AI or something else. It's offering me something that I can't do for myself. That if I add this to my workflow, I'm going to provide additional value that ultimately is not just going to give me numbers, it's going to give me something that tells me about that patient in terms of prognostication or something else that's going to be of value. Very few of these algorithms to date offer that that delta of value. Most of them are very marginal, which kind of leads into your other thing about latency workflows. I mean, there's a lot of publications now, or a lot of thought that introduction of AI is actually going to slow the radiologist down, not speed them up. It's going to give them one more thing they got to deal with, one more set of data they got to interpret, and it's going to be a problem. It's going to add to their day, not take away, at least in the near term. And so that is also going to slow the adoption curve, where you're going to have a lot of folks going, I don't want this stuff. Until you can show me real value, I'm not interested. And so...
And you need to have your infrastructure ready to receive it if you find it of value.
Well, first and foremost, it has to have a strategic business justification to add to the workflow. If you can't figure out what that is, don't do it. It's just not worth the effort.
So we all realize that because all these algorithms are advertising profusely, right? There's a lot of marketing going on, a lot of LinkedIn. I mean, if you're on your LinkedIn account for any part of the day, I mean, you're just bombarded by AI, companies' messaging. So let's say we choose a set of 5 or 10 or 15 algorithms, as Jonathan was mentioning. How do we make sure that we design those workflows and get the vendors to play ball to not disrupt workflows, right? Because very few of them, what we found as an integrator company is that in the initial stages, a couple of years ago when AI algorithms started coming out, many of them weren't even thinking in terms of Dicom images. They were just thinking in terms of JPEG images, right? So they were missing out on all the key metadata rich environment that Dicom offers. And so they've caught on to that, but they also were missing and may still be missing real workflow experience or knowledge to know at which point of the workflow they're supposed to intervene.
I think there's a step below that. If there's any AI vendors in this audience, you should first and foremost immediately go hire Dr. Eisenmenger or someone like her to tell you what your algorithm should be solving. What's the problem? I literally walk the floor and I talked to the vendors about the problem that they were solving, and they were not problems in clinical practice. They were directing their algorithms at things that they thought might be problems, they considered could be problems. You need a collaboration between a person who understands the clinical problems and the technology to come forward with a solution. If you don't have, if you're pointing your gun in the wrong direction, you're not going to hit the target. And literally walking the floor, it was like, this is not a problem. Give me something that's a real problem. And then let's start to have a discussion around how you integrate it, what the workflow looks like, how do I deal with this algorithm. But I've been doing startup for a long time. There are just zillions of startups that start and fail and burn through all their cash because they're not relevant to their customer. They're not relevant to clinical practice. Do that first. Get a clinician in there and say, hey, we think this is a problem. What do you think? And then build around that thesis rather than what you think might be their problem.
And then on the flip side, you have Kaiser Permanente, University of Wisconsin. They go straight to the real problem and develop their own AI.
Well, that's another way to do it. Okay.
Well, yeah, but you're not going to have that at every place, though. Right. But because they're developing the algorithm and they need a mechanism to deploy it, they create their own viewer. And so my nightmare scenario is I have 30 plus viewers integrated into the PACS, because it requires interaction versus the AI company partnering with the PACS vendors in order to bring that tool set in, much like an Emory toolbox, so that the physician has a common GUI that they're going to interact with. If you have to do 30 plus desktop integrations, the radiologist, first of all, you'll never get past 5. They'll kill you. Kind of like existing on the mortal plane.
I'm sort of surprised, actually, talking to AI vendors, particularly smaller AI vendors, how many of them don't even know what Dicom Web is.
Yeah.
It's sort of, how can you be here and not know that? But they don't, and they're like, well, we're just going to send the secondary capture, back to your PACS. The radiologists are going to love that. That's yet one more thing,
Yeah.
But
having to look at the images
actually
again.
using modern infrastructure to actually consume that seems to have not percolated all the way through the industry.
You get into pathology, and it's
even more.
That's pre-NEMA days.
Right.
So let's do a quick time check. We have 15 minutes left in our session, and I'd love to have some questions from the audience. We have a pretty broad topic to talk about, so are there things that we haven't talked about today? I know that there are, that you would love to chat about. Anyone? Vendor, physicians, clinicians?
Can I ask?
Please.
So one of the things people need to think about is AI products are very different from traditional products. Why? Because AI products are trained on existing practice pattern. And we know that our practice patterns change over time. How we did imaging 10 years ago with CT, MR, whatever, we don't do it anymore like that. And AI itself, utilizing that, is changing your practice pattern. So once you're going in this mode of, I'm going to use AI-based products in my practice, you have to change the mode that it's going to be now constantly evolving, changing product. It's not one PACS and I'm done. It's like I'm tuning PACS every few years because my practice pattern. You brought a new scanner in, your performance of your AI algorithm will change. Right? You start a new sequence because somebody trained from big shot Barrow Institute, and this is the new way to do imaging. For stroke, your practice pattern of that product will change, right? So you have to set that mindset now. It's not like a 3D workstation, you bought it, there's 8.2 version and can last forever. No, it'll change every time you change your practice pattern. And that fundamental digestion of that sometimes creates anxiety in the IT teams also, like there's going to be constantly evolving, and how do you address with that, how do you deal with that change? That's going to be constant.
Well, it'll change as the patients bring in their priors from outside institutions that you have zero control over. So you're going to have heterogeneity across the board continuously.
That idea of sort of reinventing new technology into the mold of the old reminds me in the first generation of PACS where we had 8 monitor stations doing tiled mode. Because that's how we learned to do it, right?
That's right.
Yeah, but you have to move past that.
And 6 specific workstations that work with each specific vendor.
Different workstations, different modality.
Yeah, it's even relevant now though. Like, for example, take like Neuro Quant. We do use it as kind of like a screening thing for anybody that's coming in for memory issues, but we actually know that like our MRI images are different than the ones that it was confirmed on.
That's right.
And we tried to do it with the ones that it was confirmed and tested on originally, but the images were much worse than we were used to, and we were not willing to do that from the clinical perspective. And so we just know that it's not going to perform the same way. And so that's why we have to like you said, it might add work, because it might for sure tell you, and it is nice that it's, gender, sex and age based, and it gives you more information. But at the same time, there's a lot of times when we don't we disagree with it, and we just say that.
But then you have to have an expert to interpret the data that's being spit from the algorithm.
Correct, which is why all of these, it's very, very difficult, because you're not going to have the same protocol, you're not going to have the same coils, you're not going to have the same anything, and so and that comes back to not every program is going to be able to QC their own stuff. We happen to have a team of scientists that QC everything. It's great, but
but that's not scalable.
That's not going to be applicable to the majority of places. So I don't know. I think it's always going to be with a grain of salt.
Yep, absolutely.
So one thing we haven't talked about that's kind of the elephant in the room is the cloud versus on-prem conversation. It's kind of uncanny to see that most of this AI technology that's being marketed today is pretty natively available in cloud, but not necessarily portable to be available on-prem. I mentioned this specifically for Kaiser, which historically has stayed away from cloud infrastructure, but what is your perspective, especially infrastructure side, on what the vendors can do to be available on-prem?
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, in our case particularly, we're going to have to become more agile on cloud. That conservatism is not going to pay in the long term. We're simply going to have to get over it. Sorry, I said that out loud, didn't I? Yeah.
The barriers are big. They're institutional, right? The funding in order to provide that type of infrastructure on-prem and keep it current.
But even if you have the funding, do you want to?
Yeah, and then
that's my problem.
Expertise to manage, maintain it, and everything else. But then you also have this element too. So if you provide a Docker, which is the ecosystem, you have to be able to manage and maintain that. Who's going to do that? So you have to get past security. And typically security's we're not touching that, put that up in the cloud.
And latency caused by having to go to a cloud and back.
Well, that's the whole timing issue and the object flow and more of the data flow. A lot of the physicians don't have to deal with, but on the back end, that's, it's definitely not plug and play yet at this point in time. And that's where I think you'll have a hybrid. Some of the algorithms are going to be better running in the cloud, and the latency's fine. It's fine to wait, 15, 20 minutes to get a result back. Others, 15, 20 minutes, they need that result in 2 minutes. And just based on the laws of physics, unless Hyperfine comes up with a 20 Tesla magnet, we can create a wormhole. We still are bound by the laws of physics to be able to move the objects up and down. So.
Yeah, we do reconstruction on the scanner. Microsoft just announced their cloud Azure-based MR reconstruction to literally send the raw data to Azure to do image reconstruction, right? So
it's outpatient.
Yeah.
If it's outpatient, that's right.
That's going to take 30 minutes or more to upload.
So
on an express route.
Yeah, I think for a while it'll be some kind of hybrid scenario. Vizia is all processing in the cloud, right? That's a stroke application that's very time critical, but they're able to do it very fast and move the needle still, right? But it's all cloud-based AI processing.
That's part of why I'm predicting that the biggest growth in the next 2 years is going to be modality side AI, upstream AI, because it's easy to provide the infrastructure. Right. If you're buying $1.5 million magnet, $20,000 of NVIDIA just kind of gets rolled in.
I think there's
move to $100,000 Hyperfine, then you don't.
Then they're going to be wondering why the MR is running slow because they're mining crypto in the
Very good. I can't imagine there's no questions here because we're talking about AI, the future of deployment of AI that's going to impact every organization here, whether you're a vendor, a clinician, a hospital organization, an infrastructure.
Ask your famous question to the audience, buddy.
My famous.
Ask question to the audience, remember?
Oh, okay.
That's your
So, how many of you already have implemented AI? I mean, how many of you are clinicians or using AI in clinical environment today? And what are the specializations for that AI? What does it do for your workflow?
It's AI docs. We use it for all for
Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you bring the microphone?
There's this poor man. She's an introvert. Now she's going to go to the microphone.
Hi, I'm at Mount Sinai in New York, and we use AI for pulmonary embolism detection in all contrast chests, which may or may not be PE-specific studies, but anything. And then separately for all non-contrast head CTs, we get a document that says no intracranial hemorrhage, and interestingly, it's automatic, so that image actually goes into the EMR, everyone sees it before we get our report out, so that's how we use it.
Okay.
If you took it away tomorrow, would you be sad? If they took it away tomorrow, would you be sad?
I mean, I'll say that, okay, so backing up a step, I'm a trainee, so I'm a chief resident there, and I think it's interesting in that I have the perspective of learning how it's going on a day-to-day basis, so I'm not necessarily sad or happy in that it affects that situation, but it's interesting that I'm able to use it in a training format in that, if we do, as part of our QI sessions, we get to do sessions on, this was an artifact, this was completely, this was off and this was right or wrong, and this is how our clinicians are reacting to it. And it's a great learning opportunity on my end. So I'd be sad if I lost it overnight just in terms of my training. And I think it's invaluable to do that as part of routine practice now that I'm not clicking on a button making, do AI on this one. It's automatic all the time. And it creates almost a standardization and understanding of how AI would affect my practice if I was to choose a practice later. Hopefully that adds that dimension.
Yeah, I think as mentors, I think we often get stuck in whatever we know, and that's what we teach, rather than where things are going and bringing those topics to our residents and fellows and saying, look, I see this coming, you should be exposed to it, you're going to need to know about this when you leave here. I think it's super easy to get stuck in whatever traditional thinking, this is the way I train, this is the way we do things, and that does not help the folks that are frankly doing all our work for us. And we need to be kind of cognizant that those themes have to be brought into the day-to-day.
Well, I can tell you what my hope is for AI, not as a industry participant, as a vendor, but as a patient. Fortunately, I haven't been to hospitals very often in my life, and I hope that continues, right? But my hope for AI is that it will help the physicians that me and my loved ones deal with spend more time being physicians with us as humans, right? That we're not so, that physicians aren't so bogged down by administrivia, and that AI will help them free up more time to be with their patients. I think that's the...
We haven't really touched on this at all, and this conversation has largely been structured on images. I personally believe that's a much longer term opportunity. I think the near term opportunity is taking some of the cognitive load that we all have from scheduling through no-shows to all the rest of it, all the textural things. How about the consumption of the EMR and presenting the profile of that patient based on AI? There's a whole host of things that are very technically easy to do that we can all agree would have a business justification to add value, but historically, as imagers, we tend to focus on the images in AI instead of, the other 98% of opportunity that AI could automate processes that we're currently wasting our time doing.
Okay.
Take my genomic data and give me a score, become the disease.
Well, we've reached the end of our hour. I'm very grateful for our panelists for being here and sharing your experience and your opinions and your vision of where things are going. I think if anyone in the audience wishes to, stay in touch and ask questions via email, we're happy to do that. Feel free to, visit some of us. You can find Dr. Siddiqui at the Hyperfine booth. We're actually very nearby there as well. If you want to talk about AI integration. Thank you for being here, everyone. Appreciate you being here.
I'm an SC grad, I don't know if you know that.